Today we're going to talk about emotion and emotion regulation in aging. I'm Robert Kennison. So we're going to focus on our human emotions and the range of emotions that we experience. We're always also going to talk about how we can learn to regulate our emotions, to control the emotional responses that we have. And then finally, we're going to look at the effects of age on emotion and emotion regulation to see whether things get better, get worse, or how things might change. So to get us started, we need to focus on the basics. And in this case, that means understanding the basic definitions of emotion and emotion regulation. So, in the parlance of cognitive psychology, emotions are defined as feeling states that vary in valence and intensity. They are linked to brain activity and cannot be separated from brain activity. And one part of the brain that is often associated with emotional responding is the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system and important for both emotions and emotional memories. Emotions can be defined as feeling states, as I had said, that vary in valence and intensity. So let's talk about the difference between valence and intensity. Valence is the positivity or negativity of an emotion, where sadness and happiness vary in valence from negative emotions to positive emotions. And so for every emotion we have, we can rank it on its valence, where anger, for example, would have a negative valence. Um, uh, and of course, happiness would have a positive valence. And so in that sense, valence can be thought of as a continuum from negative to positive. A second way of rating an emotion is the intensity of that emotion. And so if we're talking about anger as one of the basic emotions, it has an intensity range that can go from, let's say, a minor annoyance at the weak intensity side up to rage, where we would see a high intensity of anger. So the two ways that we can categorize our emotions or rank them is in terms of valence and intensity. The second definition that we need to clarify is what emotion regulation involves. And it involves actions that we use to alter the valence or intensity of a feeling state, meaning we can learn to make emotions less negative, more positive. We can also learn to de-intensify negative emotions and perhaps add intensity to positive emotions. And through these uh, emotion regulation behaviors that we develop, we can gain control over our emotions. Here we have an example of valence and intensity, where in this case, intensity is defined as arousal. So valence is on the x-axis, arousal or intensity is on the y-axis. And as we move away from the left side of the graph, valence becomes more positive, and from the bottom up, arousal becomes greater. So if we look at the left three pictures, the stack of pictures, we see negatively valenced images, one of a uh, 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 oh, cleaning, say, a bathroom, one of cigarettes, and one of the 9/11 towers being destroyed. And so all of those are negative valence images, but they range in arousal from weak to very, very strong. And then if we go to the right side of the graph, we see positive images um, that also vary in arousal, where we have just a beautiful picture of, let's say, a sunrise and reflecting off clouds. And that is weak arousal, but a very pleasant image. Then we have hot air balloons, which of course are really, theoretically wonderful to fly in and look at. That would be medium arousal. And then another positive image, but one that also is highly arousing, would be this person standing on a peak looking across at other mountains. So these are examples of the ways in which we can uh, look at the valence and arousal of different emotions. In this case, using photographs, which have been ranked on valence and arousal. Let's talk about the importance of emotions. It's something that I think sort of goes unsaid, but we certainly have great appreciation. We want to have positive emotions. They give us a sense of um, meaning in life, if you will. Negative emotions can do the same thing. But why are emotions part of the human experience? And so evolutionary theory suggests that emotions are important to human survival and have been part of the human experience, uh, from our evolutionary development. So emotions can help direct our behaviors, such as seeking foods for the pleasure of enjoying a food, fleeing dangerous things where we have fear as an emotion that drives us to get away from things that could hurt us. The positive emotions that we experience when we work together and accomplish a goal, and of course, reproduction, our ability um, reproduce the species and keep it going through love and attraction. There are 6 common human emotions that have been identified, and those emotions are sadness, happiness, fear, surprise, anger, and disgust. And actually, disgust is kind of a more newly identified emotions. And so these 6 emotions um, are thought to basically capture all the emotional experiences we have if we vary them on valence and on intensity. And these basic emotions are age invariant, which means that the emotions that we have as younger adults are going to be the emotions that we have as older adults. It's not like we develop new emotional states. It's these 6 basic emotion states that we experience. However, as we're going to discover in the remainder of this lecture, the intensity and frequency of these emotional states may differ as we get older. So consider that you just found out about the death of a close friend. And this is an example of how our emotions might differ from young age to old age. So if you find out about the death of a close friend, how are you going to cope with that loss? And importantly, who do you think is better prepared to handle such situations, a young adult or an older adult? And why do you think there may be age differences in the ability to cope with the loss of a friend? So I invite you to think about that. In our discussion of emotions and aging, we're going to talk about different ways in which young and older adults and everybody in between experiences emotions. And the first topic that we're going to take up is emotion identification and aging. So emotion identification is the ability to recognize different emotion states in others through our what we see and what we hear. So by way of example, you may be talking to a friend who is very upset about something that's happened in their life. And you can see that on their face. You can see it in their gestures. You can also hear it in their voice. So this ability that we have to make emotion identifications has been studied to see whether young and older adults are equally adept at emotion identification. And so studies of recognizing emotions in facial expressions suggest that older adults are less able to identify sadness, fear, and anger compared to younger adults. So, in fact, there is some loss of the ability to identify certain emotions in older age. But in that study, older adults were equal in their ability to identify disgust. So this suggests that through our vision, there are some age differences that exist, and those age differences also appear in auditory detection studies that show that older adults are less able to hear certain emotions reflected in speech compared to younger adults. So emotion identification seems to show some decline as we age, and this may be partially linked to changes in vision and hearing, but it may also be linked to kind of a bit of a dampening of our emotions as we age. In this slide, we see uh, a full range of emotions in the headshots of the different individuals shown in this photograph. And so you can look at it and identify many of the different emotions and the intensity of those emotions. And so thinking of the 6 emotions that we talked about, what emotions do you see in some of these photos? And so just briefly, in the upper left corner, I see somebody who seems to be very happy. And then over on the upper right corner, I see somebody who seems to be perhaps disappointed. So I invite you to look at these different emotions. And this represents an array of emotions that young and older adults might be asked to identify when participating in a study like the ones that I described in the previous slide. So another aspect of uh, human emotions, is emotional complexity, and the question of um, uh, are our complex emotions something that we do equally well as young and older adults? So, emotional complexity is the co-occurrence of positive and negative emotions. So, what that means is that complex emotions are the emotions that we have that include multiple combinations of the emotions that we have. So, for example, can you experience joy and sadness at the same time? And I suspect you would say yes. um, I, I I have had those experiences where I am both joyful and sad at the same time. What about anger and happiness? And I suspect yes, at times we have both anger and happiness co-occur, which may seem odd, but I believe that it does happen. And then finally, sadness and disgust. Again, a complex set of emotions that co-occur. And so, with respect to studies on aging and emotional complexity, it actually, and this is good news for us as we age, it's actually been found that older adults can experience complex emotions, and in some cases, they do so more than younger adults. So it seems like the effects of age, experience, and perhaps something we might refer to as wisdom seems to protect our ability for emotional complexity and perhaps even increase our abilities. Now let's focus on our emotional well-being and aging. So, one way of defining emotional well-being is the sum of our positive and emotion and negative emotion states over time. So you could actually imagine a study in which people are uh, asked to periodically record their emotion states. And then over a day or several days, we the emotion states that a person experiences are essentially summed up. They're rated for both intensity and valence, and then summed up to give an indication of a person's emotional well-being. Using this kind of uh, study, both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies suggest that emotional well-being is largely lifespan. And in fact, there tends to be a move towards greater positivity and away from negativity in older adults. So it looks like emotional well-being is pretty stable, and there is some greater emphasis on the positive and a de-emphasis on the negative. This also coincides with other measures of emotional well-being. So, for example, if we look at depression, and depression scores collected from depression scales, we see that older adults as a group are actually less depressed than other adult age groups. So there seems to be a positive trend away from depression as we age. We also see that life satisfaction for older adults is stays strong, and in many cases increases. So generally speaking, emotional well-being, our sense of sort of adding up the positives and the negatives over time, that remains stable or even gets a little better with age. So far, we've talked about emotion, our human emotional experience, and we did it in the context of aging, where we talked about really emotions across the adult lifespan. And so we focused on emotion identification, where um, older adults do seem to have some deficit in their ability to detect emotional experiences from others, both visually and auditorily. We talked about emotional complexity, where we saw that um, older adults are just as able and perhaps even better at dealing with complex emotions and the experience of having complex emotions. We also talked about emotional well-being, where we found out that older adults are actually have very high levels of emotional well-being. Now we're going to move on to emotion regulation, this idea that we can control our emotional experience. We can control the valence and intensity of the emotions that we experience through learning um, and experience over time. So emotion regulation involves actions that we use to alter an experience's valence and intensity. And of course, those emotional experiences could be from within, or they could be something that we experience that is sort of placed on us from the external world. In terms of emotion regulation, older adults seem to be advantaged compared to younger adults in controlling their emotions. They actually do very well. And for example, in intense personal exchanges, older adults are more likely to try to de-escalate an intense situation compared to younger adults. So rather than engage, they're more likely to disengage and wait for a better time to re-engage in a more emotionally controlled manner. So this and other examples suggest that emotion regulation actually performance with age may get better. So, one aspect of emotion regulation is emotion focused coping. And this is basically the ability to use emotion regulation strategies to manage stressful situations. Imagine losing a friend. There isn't a clear uh, thing that somebody can do to make the situation disappear. That friend has been lost. So instead, we have to regulate our emotional response. And research on emotion focused coping suggests that older adults are actually better at doing focused coping. This is partly due to the fact that older adults tend to find themselves confronted with situations that can't be problem solved. And so they have to use emotion focused coping. So they actually do more of it. And also that older adults can use life experiences and these can reflect on their life experiences, and these memories allow them to better use emotion focused coping. And this is what I call the been there, done that principle. The idea that having been in stressful situations uh, time and time again, and more often than younger adults, gives older adults the sense that they're able to handle a situation, And one might call this the wisdom associated with aging, the idea that you get a greater sense of, I've been there, I've done that, I can get through this, compared to younger adults. So we've talked a bit about emotion regulation, and we found that actually older adults are better in managing their emotions, both the intensity and the valence of their emotions compared to younger adults. And I want to emphasize that this is a really positive thing about aging. We've talked about a lot of declines in um, perception, declines in memory, declines in attention. But here we have something that older adults do better, and this will contribute to a sense of well-being that is likely to increase as we get older. So let's look at some of the explanations for age differences in emotion regulation. And so several models have been proposed to explain these age differences in emotional processing across the lifespan. And the models that we're going to focus on are the selective optimization with compensation for emotion regulation, the SOC-ER model by Baltes and his associates, in particular, Uri. We're also going to focus on the SAVI model, the strength and vulnerability integration model proposed by Susan T. Charles and her colleagues. And then finally, we'll finish out by focusing on the socio-emotional selectivity theory proposed by Laura Carstensen and her colleagues. So before we talk about the SOC-ER model, I should probably introduce the initial model that preceded that and led to its development, and that is the selective optimization with compensation model proposed by Baltes and Baltes. That would be Paul Baltes and Margaret Baltes, a husband and wife team located in Germany at the Max Planck Institute that have been really seminal in our understanding of the aging processes that affect us. And together they propose the selective optimization with compensation model to essentially help older adults perform well given old age and cognitive and physical declines. So they essentially argue that um, if an older adult wants to thrive and be able to live an engaged life that allows them to do a variety of interesting things in with high levels of ability, uh, that older adults should engage in three processes. The first is selection, which is deciding which goals and activities to engage in and cutting out other activities. So essentially, this is the idea of becoming more selective, getting rid of non-important tasks and focusing on, let's say, hobbies or activities that a person wants to take seriously. So this could be perhaps in my case, photography, or in another person's case, really focusing on their musician skills. Once we have selected out what we want to do, then we should work to optimize our performance. So this is optimization, which is the process of maximizing performance by practicing, seeking more education, and honing skills. So now that we've sort of cleared up some time through selection, we can spend additional time focusing on developing and maintaining our skill level. And the third aspect or recommendation is compensation. And this is the process of making changes to adapt to our changing abilities by finding workarounds. So if somebody is loves to do woodwork, maybe moving away from hand tools to power tools would make things easier. So I'm providing an example that I kind of can relate to. Let's imagine an older adult with hearing difficulties. And so rather than focusing on music, they focus on photography. So that would be the process of selection, working to learn and improve his pictures, optimization, and purchasing a lighter and better camera, one that takes less work, and that would be compensation. So now that we've briefly defined the selective optimization with compensation model proposed by Baltes and Baltes, let's talk about Uri's 2010 adaptation of the SOC model, known as the Selective Optimization with Compensation for Emotion Regulation model. And here the idea is that older adults should select the emotion regulation strategies that work best for them, uh, uh, given their cognitive resources that they have. So essentially, this is the SOC model, but applied to our emotion regulation strategies. So given declines in executive function, things like decision making and working memory, and more generally in our ability to remember things, an older adult might apply selection by choosing a smaller circle of friends compared to younger adults. And in fact, this is something that does happen. Older adults have smaller social circles, but those social circles are often optimized to become more emotionally supportive, and compensation can be applied by devoting more time to maintaining the friendships in those smaller social circles. So that would be an example of the soccer model. So we've talked about the soccer model. A rather similar but differently focused model was proposed by Susan T. Charles, and it's known as the Strength and Vulnerability Integration Model, the SAVI model. And in that model, she argues that positive well-being in older adults is best achieved by relying on one's strengths while acknowledging limitations and avoiding vulnerabilities. So, what are limitations and vulnerabilities? In the SAVI model, vulnerabilities are um, associated with negative emotions that relate to stress and declining physiology. The reduction of negative emotions to essentially reduce stress responses that are associated with changes in our physiological responding, where older adults are likely to have higher blood pressure compared to younger adults and are more susceptible to heart attacks. So, one thing that I think we begin to notice as we age is when we have a stressful situation, the physical effects of that stressful situation seem to be more drastic, more dire than we were when we were younger. And we actually know that heart attacks can be associated with stressful situations, and heart attacks are much more common in older adults. We also know that with high blood pressure, when somebody experiences a stressful situation, they feel that blood pressure gain. They might be able to hear the pounding. They feel it sort of in their head and in their chest. And so these vulnerabilities are noticed by older adults. And given the knowledge and sense of those vulnerabilities, older adults use their strengths, their increased emotion regulation abilities to avoid conflict, therefore protecting themselves against these vulnerabilities. So older adults become skilled at navigating their lives to reduce stress inducing conflicts. So imagine this. A younger adult might be willing to get into an argument in a social situation that could potentially lead to some kind of fight. And it's well known that they're more likely to do this than older adults. And so why would older adults be less likely to get into fights than younger adults? Well, physically they're not prepared for fights as well, but they also know that their bodies simply are not able to handle the stress. So they work to avoid these kinds of situations. And this is very much an example of improved emotion regulation and a motivator for improved emotion regulation. The final theory that I want to talk about that seeks to explain differences in emotions and emotion regulation and aging is the socio-emotional selectivity theory proposed by Laura Carstensen. And this theory is one that I personally find very intriguing. I've focused some of my research on testing something called the positivity effect in aging. So in the socio-emotional selectivity theory, it is a lifespan theory of motivation, which proposes that as time horizons shrink with older age, that is, as we get closer to our deaths, people become increasingly selective in what they choose to do, investing greater resources in emotionally meaningful goals and activities. And Laura Carstensen essentially derived this theory in a study done in 1994. This is a lifespan theory of motivation and emotion control. And essentially, the essence of this theory is that as we age, our perception of time left changes, where younger adults perceive their time as expansive. And most people who are taking this class are younger adults. I doubt very much you think a lot about how much time you have left. And realistically speaking, if you're in your 20s, you've probably spent about 1/4, maybe 1/3 of your life so far. That still provides a very broad time horizon. But consider older adults and how they perceive their time. They perceive their time as limited. Somebody in their 80s, for example, who might expect to live 5, 10, maybe 15 years, 20 years if they're really fortunate. And they've already spent 80 years on this earth, so they realize that their time left is limited. And when you have that realization, that sort of existential realization that life is short and time left is limited, that changes the way that people want to spend their time. So, because younger adults perceive time as expansive, they are more likely to engage in expansive and uncertain goals. They're basically willing to risk their time to build their life and try new things, decide what they like. So they tend to focus on future oriented, knowledge related goals. And so that's where you guys are young, you're getting education. You don't know how that education is going to work out for you, but you know that it's something that sets you up for the remainder of your life. It's an investment you're making. You're also meeting new people. You may be out dating or trying to find a life partner. Again, a lot of investment in things that may or may not work out. But they're important because it sets you up. Because older adults perceive time as limited, they become increasingly selective in what they want to do. And so they're likely to invest greater resources in emotionally meaningful activities. They're more likely to spend time with emotionally supportive relationships and a smaller circle of friends, but those friends are likely to support their emotional goals. And so they're also likely to seek out present oriented emotional goals rather than um, future oriented, more distant goals. Now, this doesn't mean that an older person might not seek out further education, but they're doing it to enhance their current life, not really with the expectation that they're going to get a new job that their education is going to support. So, an interesting finding of research done in the area of the socio-emotional selectivity theory is something called the positivity effect in aging. And the positivity effect in aging is the finding that older adults compared to younger adults prefer, better process, and better remember positive information over negative information. And the motivation, according to Carstensen and Mather, um, another researcher who's done a lot of this kind of research, is that as our perceived time horizon is narrowing, we're getting closer to our deaths, we really don't want to be surrounded by negative information. We want things to be more positive, to be more emotionally supportive. And so the socio-emotional selectivity predicts a positivity effect in aging. And in fact, this is an observation which has been made and supported. So older adults prefer positive over negative information. Given a choice and a freedom to choose, older adults tend to prefer and select positive information over negative information in terms of what they read, what they watch, who they're with, etc. And this is actually not necessarily true for younger adults. They're more often more likely to want to learn about negative events, accidents, tragedies. It's because they're very emotionally engaging and have a certain excitement factor to them. In addition, older adults pay greater attention to positive information. So, in studies that use eye tracking, where people are given photographs of positive, neutral, or negative information, research has shown that um, older adults will intentionally look at the positive information more than the negative information. They actually tend to avoid the negative uh, photographs. And another finding that supports this positivity effect is in memory, where given positive, negative, and neutral information to remember, older adults are likely to remember more positive relative to negative information. And in all of these instances where older adults prefer positive information, they pay greater attention to positive information, and they remember more positive information. There is often evidence that younger adults are attracted to negative information. So it's a really interesting effect. In this slide on the left panel or left side of the slide, we see simply the way that modern eye tracking is done to really pinpoint where the pupil is looking on an image. And in the right side of this slide, we see some data from a memory study of the positivity effect, where people are shown positive images, and that would be the one at the top right, B. Neutral and negative images, C, where somebody is in a mortuary, and then D, neutral images where people are simply buying some things. And so what we see in the graph is that compared to young adults who better remember both positive and negative informations compared to neutral pictures, older adults remember more positive uh, images relative to both negative and neutral images. And middle-aged adults are somewhere in between, so it kind of indicates a shift in memory. But when we compare the young and the older adults, we see evidence of a clear positivity effect in aging. Some important findings associated with the positivity effect in aging, this idea that older adults are attracted to better process and better remember positive relative to negative information compared to younger adults, is that the positivity effect is not really linked to age, but rather perception of time left. So age is simply a proxy for time left, where studies have shown that younger adults who actually have a limited life expectancy, let's say somebody who has a terminal illness and knows that they're likely to die in the not too distant future, That younger adults actually show a positivity effect similar to older adults. So it isn't linked to age, it's linked to perception of time left. And I think that's an important point. Secondly, the positivity effect is not a bias that, uh, you know, glasses that shade everything that a person sees, but rather it's a choice where older adults choose positive over negative information. And so, how do we know this? Well, Mather in 2005 and her colleagues showed that the positivity effect is stronger in people with greater cognitive resources compared to those older adults with reduced resources. So basically, people who are better able to process information choose positive over negative information. And those who have greater cognitive impairment um, tend to not be able to make that choice as well. Secondly, research by Lokenhoff and Carstensen has shown that when older adults need to make decisions that are important, for example, to their health, and to make those decisions, they need to consider negative information. Older adults can override their desire for positive information and deal with negative information so that they can make informed decisions. Again, this is this idea that the positivity effect is a choice rather than an overriding bias. Today's topic focused on human emotions across the lifespan and also on our ability to regulate those emotions in various ways. So, as we close out this lecture, I want to draw some final conclusions based on some of the things that we've learned. First, older adults display a full range of emotions, although their ability to perceive emotions in others may be somewhat impaired. But still, they have the same emotions that you have as younger adults. Second, older adults generally have better emotion regulation skills compared to younger adults. There's considerable evidence that supports this idea, and there's also the been there, done that principle that suggests that life experience helps us develop our emotion regulation skills. Third, older adults adapt to cognitive and physical declines by employing emotion regulation strategies. So basically, as our cognitive abilities decline, as we also notice greater reactivity in blood pressure and perceive dangers of things like heart attacks and so forth, we adapt and learn to better regulate our emotions. The SOC-ER and SAVI models suggest that older adults use emotion regulation strategies to maximize well-being and avoid potentially dangerous stress. The models have somewhat different focus, but they are similar in this idea that older adults need to and actually naturally do make adjustments, adapt so that they can better handle emotions in older age. And then the final theory that we focused on, the SST, the socio-emotional selectivity theory, suggested that the narrowing of time left or perceived time left to live affects our decisions and desires where older adults are more likely to focus on present-oriented and emotionally supportive experiences. And this is in contrast to younger adults who are more focused on um, uh, uh, potentially risky uses of their time that will set their life, their future up for a positive future. And then finally, we talked about the positivity effect and the notion that older adults choose to surround themselves with positive rather than negative information.